Hello and welcome to Table Talk Tuesday. I'm your host for this event, Trevor Bruner. Today, it is my pleasure to be joined by Jesse Pierce from Crosspoint Human Services at the Y. Now, Jesse Pierce is the Partner Abuse Intervention Coordinator for Crosspoint Human Services. He's worked in the anti-violence movement since 2000, starting at the YWCA of Danville, and then as a trainer for the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Iowa Coalition Against Sexual Assault. In his current capacity at Crosspoint, he facilitates 5 weekly groups for individuals who cause harm. Jesse, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you, Trevor. And right off, I want to say that I certainly do not facilitate those groups for people that cause harm by myself. So now might be a good time to thank and acknowledge Deb Saunders and Tanya Morgan, who are both co-facilitators for those weekly groups and amazing additions. So thanks, Tanya. Thanks, Deb.
A big shout out to all the work that you guys do over there. It takes a lot of hard work to deal with the difficulties against violence in relationships and to help those on working forward in futures. And now with October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I really wanted to dive into a deeper discussion with you, specifically addressing males who are victims of intimate partner abuse. So let's start then for some of our listeners and talk about the different myths and stereotypes that exist in our society about this. So to begin, Jesse, do you believe that the reported statistics are accurate when it comes to men in intimate violence relationships?
Not necessarily, no. I feel like we know that domestic violence is one of the most underreported crimes. And when we think about male identified survivors and victims, that's even more so. And that's really linked to that whole idea of, that fear of not being believed, the fear of being blamed, the fear of being seen as like less than a man, right? So what we hear from a lot of male survivors is that they're not taken even seriously when they report to family, even or friends, or then those systems, which we'll probably talk about a little more in a second. But that whole idea that men are always the individuals who cause harm is pretty pervasive in our culture, and I think that's basically, excuse me, based on that notion that the media tells us and what the media feeds us in terms of what domestic looks like, what domestic violence looks like, or what it sounds like. And because of that exposure to media, we've become desensitized and even normalized and even accustomed to the idea that men are the individuals who cause harm in domestic violence relationships, when we know that that is not necessarily true, right? It is not, number one, normal. Domestic violence is not normal, and it's not a joke, and it's not something that we should readily accept as only happening to women, because in fact, it does happen to men as well.
And understanding some of these barriers for reporting for men can really help us to see how something as serious as abuse can be so easily overlooked by many. It's and how the gender roles and masculinity can often play a huge impact on these situations. Now, since many struggle with differentiating between these myths against males and domestic violence, what are some of the signs that a man may be experiencing intimate partner violence?
Well, honestly, Trevor, the signs can be difficult to like pinpoint specifically. And one of the reasons for this is that we have, again, thanks to the media and to the culture, this idea that domestic violence is strictly physical, right? That if I'm a victim of domestic violence, that you're going to be able to see bruises, that you're going to be able to see marks on my arms, all these ideas that we have of what domestic violence looks like, when in fact we know that it's way more than just physical violence, that it's emotional abuse, that it's economic abuse, that it's verbal abuse, that it's also sexual abuse. And so getting that away from that idea that domestic violence is just a physical form of violence is one of the most important things to think about. And in terms of the invisibility of it, for male survivors, um, you know, it's probably likely something that is about male survivors blaming themselves, right? Them not feeling like they were man enough. That whole idea of what a male and a man is supposed to look like in our culture, right? That they are strong and that they're tough and they can handle whatever and stay in control at whatever cost, is something that is really important to think about here, because we know that that stops men from reporting any violence that they may have experienced, right? So if we think about individuals like going into to a law, speaking to law enforcement, or calling to make a report, right? As a male calling to make a report about domestic violence, oftentimes I'm going to be met with, um, you know, someone who I'm going to have to educate, right? So the person that picks up the other end of that phone, it's not uncommon for male identified survivors to hear, "Well, wait a minute, you're male. Can this happen to you?" So that is something that I don't necessarily feel like that any survivor should have to explain when they're reaching out to systems to report, for support, whatever. And that oftentimes is something that experience of a male survivor is oftentimes trivialized by law enforcement, by medical staff, um, by the court system, and oftentimes even by victim services. And we're really working to change that. So just that idea of the fear and the shame and the isolation and the guilt because I wasn't man enough to deal with this, because I wasn't in control of this situation, I let this happen to me, when in fact somebody else does this to you, right? It's not something to blame the victim, and oftentimes victims blame themselves. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning here, that this is something that when men have talked about their experiences, that it's oftentimes laughed off, even or not believed, or it just seems like this thing that it's like your fault because you didn't handle it, and you're a man and you should handle your business because that's what men do. So that whole idea of fighting back, or that whole idea of you weren't strong enough, really exists. And for a man to step forward in our culture today and say, "Hey, this has happened to me," that's really a pretty radical act, right? Because, well, just because the men deserve to have services, men deserve to be believed, men deserve to be heard and have their stories honored, and men deserve the opportunity to heal, just like all survivors.
Absolutely. In like you were talking about previously, it can be a huge challenge for men when stepping forward. Like you touched on, the culture that surrounds it can make it difficult for men to talk about these situations in terms of their masculinity and how society may view them. But as again you touched on, it's very important that to remember that they are still victims and they need to be taken seriously. It takes a lot of courage for men to be able to step forward in our society and face all of those different various barriers and systems that you talked about. So speaking of these courageous men, what are some of the next steps the man can take if they are in one of these abusive relationships?
Well, at first, I feel like the very first step that a man can take is that um, they need to understand that, again, this is something that um, happened to them. It is not something that they asked for. They didn't bring it on themselves. It's not their fault. Also, utilizing support systems, and that is also something that's difficult for men to do in our culture. Again, because of that training that we all received about men reaching out for help, men utilizing support systems in any way, reaching out for help, admitting that they need help, admitting that something's wrong, admitting that taking that front or that guise away, that everything's fine, it's all good, and I can handle this. So just giving themselves permission to speak about it. And I do want to add that this is a point where I feel like it's important to say for anybody out there that is listening to somebody talk about their experience of violence, um, our reaction is super important to their healing, right? If I'm a friend and I have a friend of mine telling me that he is experiencing violence in any form, um, what's important for him to know is that I believe him, that I don't think it's his fault, that I'm sorry that it happened to him, and that he can and will heal, right? Um, so I think it's important for all of us to think about that and how our reaction or our response to somebody who's reaching out to us, and this specifically also includes children, because children also are oftentimes not believed and have to tell over and over when something they've experienced violence in some way. So us initially believing men, believing children when they disclose any form of violence that has happened to them is like directly related to uh, the way that they're going to heal. So being supportive and kind of knowing what that looks like, not feeling like you need to have all the answers, right? And again, I'm speaking of somebody who's hearing somebody explain their situation, right? I don't need to say, well, how could you have let this happen to yourself? Or like, you weren't tough enough, you weren't strong enough. Those are exactly the things that keep men from coming forward and talking about their experience. So it's important for, I guess, for all of us as a culture to talk about the way we respond to victims of violence. And specifically, in this instance, we're talking about men who've experienced violence, and being affirmative and not, the goal is to harm less and affirm more, right? So keeping that in mind, I think in terms of next steps, also reaching out to the services that are available in our community is, an essential step should someone feel comfortable in doing that.
As our community and culture around the nation grows, we need to, as you say, we need to be that support. I completely agree. I think we need to be the change ourselves to ensure that those who are going through these horrible situations are believed, supported, and feel comfortable in reaching out. So that way they can get the help they need on their journey to heal and reach the services that they may need to do so. Now, in those services, I know that you work with Crosspoint. So what are some of those services that Crosspoint offers?
So Crosspoint is a resource in the community for individuals who have experienced domestic violence. And we do that in various ways. So oftentimes we see that coming through our 24-hour, 7-day-a-week support hotline. And the number for that, Trevor, is 888-549-1800. Again, the crisis support for domestic violence victims is 888-549-1800. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to hear whoever's going to pick up that phone is an amazing advocate, right? We have an amazing domestic violence staff here at Crosspoint, all of whom are willing to help, to listen, to meet whatever need the survivor may identify as the most important need for them. This is also going to happen in a non-judgmental way and importantly, anonymously, if that's the desire of the male or any victim calling. So we also provide in-person counseling and legal advocacy to meet those needs. And we also serve children who have been exposed to domestic violence in a counseling and advocacy capacity as well. So those are some of the ways that Crosspoint can help male victims and all victims of domestic violence.
Amazing. It sounds like Crosspoint has so much to offer for the community, and I already know from some members of the community myself that it does a great service to those around them. It sounds like it's really making a difference. So to any listeners who may have friends or who knows, may themselves be in a situation, don't be afraid to reach out and make use of these local services that are there specifically to help you through those troubling times. Now, Jesse, thank you so much for being here with us today on Table Talk Tuesday. This has been a fantastic and hugely informative discussion. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. Appreciate you reaching out and for us making this happen. Thank you, Trevor.
Anytime. Now, that is it for today's Table Talk discussion. This has been your host, Trevor Bruner, and signing off.